The other part of the healthy work environment that I want to address, and these are just the two examples that we're going to look at, first staffing, and then we'll also look at meaningful recognition. But certainly we could pick any part of the healthy work environment and say, how can we help with burnout? How can we look at this in a holistic way? But meaningful recognition, as I mentioned, is near and dear to my heart because meaningful recognition is such a sharp tool in your toolbox. It's not as expensive, it's not as long-term, it's something that's available and readily accessible to all our leaders, and I'll venture to say we don't use it enough. Now again, in a healthy work environment, these are the components that are identified as having a meaningful recognition program. So it's, again, not an off-the-cuff, I'm going to recognize you in whatever way I think works. You want to have a formal system that makes your staff feel valued. And you want it to be formal because you want them to know it exists and you want to make it equitable in the existence for all. You also want everyone to have access at being able to thank and recognize. So administrators, nurse managers, physicians, nurses, patients, you want everybody to be able to tell them good job. It's not just the ability of one person to be able to say thank you. And you want it to do more than just that off-the-hand thank you. You want it to be a motivating opportunity for personal growth, development, and advancement. And this may seem like a big agenda, but I put the DAISY example here because the DAISY program is an example of a meaningful recognition program that embodies all of these components. And there are certainly other examples out there of meaningful recognition programs, or organizations may create their own programs, but what you want to make sure is that it includes all of these pieces. Now, what happens when you give recognition? And I think this is really important for a leader to understand, to make that connection for how it relates to decreasing burnout and increasing compassion satisfaction. So these are components from the book by Gary Chapman and Paul White, The 5 Languages of Appreciation in the Workplace. And these are the same writers that wrote the 5 love languages, but they translated it to languages of appreciation for work. And you can see that it's very similar because we all want recognition in some way. And when you think about recognition and the components that we just talked about, you have to remember that everybody's different. And as a leader, when you recognize that people are different in how they want to be recognized and receive recognition, that also helps you to understand your employees and give them what they need to boost that compassion satisfaction. So let's go through these and think about some examples. And there's no, it's purposeful that we put words of affirmation first because so many people respond to words of affirmation. When you think about giving someone positive praise or telling them a job good done, it is so affirming as an employee. But what happens here is there is actually a way to not do it so well. There's not power in just walking by and saying good job. Employees actually don't want to hear a bland good job from their boss. So being specific about the work that they do and doing it just in time, getting in that moment and telling them exactly what they did for a good job, especially in healthcare, when we know we're making a difference, but when we do it day after day, it can lose its meaning. And this is why programs that use patient affirmations and the patients describe in either written or coming back and thanking the patient or the caregiver are so important because they know that they made a difference. And when you're caring for patients day after day, sometimes that gets lost. If you've heard of the Quint Studer program and the emphasis that they place on thank you cards and writing thank you cards to their employees, this is a form of words of affirmation. And you'll hear employees say, it was so meaningful to me to get a thank you card at my home from my employer, from my boss, because I know they really value me. Another way to look at words of affirmation, again, doing it just in time, think about doing it in front of others. So not only are you giving those affirmations to that person, you're sharing that affirmation with others so that they can see how valuable you feel about your employees. So think about an opportunity of walking into a unit nursing station and telling an employee, you not only really appreciate them, but you appreciate them for that certain act that you just witnessed that you did, and you really value them. So you're not only recognizing that employee, but whoever's listening to that is now hearing those words of affirmation. So again, you want to make sure that that is a form of recognition for that employee. Certainly if that employee doesn't appreciate words of affirmation or public words of affirmation, that's not going to work for them. But understanding how your employee appreciates affirmation, that can be a very, very valuable tool in helping decrease burnout and boost compassion satisfaction. Think about some of the others. Quality time. So when we talk about spending quality time, you hear constantly nurses say, I never see my manager. I never see my boss. They're always in their office. These are employees that appreciate their language of appreciation is quality time. So maybe you do time cards with your supervisor. Maybe when you're rounding, it's not the quick check-in, but it's actually spending a moment to talk with them, hear a story, spending more time with them than you would think. Acts of service, another constant thing that we hear from nurses and employees is, my manager put on scrubs and she got on the floor with us, and they're blown away by the acts of service, right? And so this is, you recognize in these employees that their language of appreciation is they want their manager in the trenches with them, working with them. And this isn't always possible, but to recognize and to understand that this is a language of appreciation for some types of employees goes a long way in understanding how to boost compassion satisfaction, how to decrease burnout. Tangible gifts always makes me laugh. This is probably the funniest in the nursing profession. When you think about Nurses Weeks and organizations giving out gifts, there are some people who just love the swag. They love what organizations give, and there are many, many, many who, no matter what you give them, it will never be enough. And for these people, a gift is not their language of appreciation. And so, it might not be that they're ungrateful. It might just be that it's not their language of appreciation. And so thinking about gifts in that way, right? And thinking about why pizza doesn't always go over well when you buy your unit pizza after the end of a long shift, right? It might just be that they want you to sit down with them in the unit and spend some quality time with them. And so thinking about the language of appreciation for your unit. And then finally, physical touch. Now this one's a little difficult, not only in our current HR environment and with our policies, but also in the time of COVID. When we have restrictions around physical touch. So thinking about what works, maybe it's high fives or fist bumps or recognizing what's important, a pat on the back, but also knowing that our units struggle and our nursing and our workforce struggles, and sometimes a hug is appropriate. And so recognizing within the limits of your organization and your relationship with your employees, how physical touch plays into that. But certainly that is a language of appreciation recognized as well. And then the last aspect that I want to touch on. So we talked about creating that healthy work environment and how we can look at staffing and decreasing burnout. And we talked about meaningful recognition as a nurse leader. But remember that other aspect besides decreasing burnout is secondary traumatic stress. And one thing to be very clear on is secondary traumatic stress is not going to go away. This is part of the work that we're in. We can't avoid it. It will always exist. So what's really important to note is that we have to mitigate it and putting strategies in place to mitigate it. We're not making it go away. There's no way to eliminate it. So as a nurse leader, how can we mitigate it for ourselves and how can we mitigate it for our staff? And so thinking about creating this community or creating unit-based interventions, and then not only creating this type of support, but utilizing it. Because it's one thing to create it, but if we don't have the culture and the environment where people take part and they utilize it, and this is the big part or the role for the nurse leader to role model in, then this is where we can get at decreasing some of that secondary traumatic stress. So some examples in this area is the postcode pause. Remember, we talked about that opportunity to build in the structure and the processes for a break, a pause, right? If we know that we have a code event or we have something happening, we don't want to immediately move on to the next one. We think about that opportunity where we can stop, pause, honor what just happened there, honor the work that we did as clinicians. When I speak to people about this burnout and the secondary traumatic stress in our environment, there's usually not a time that goes by where a clinician cannot tell me about a significant event during their clinical career that still impacts them, that they still ruminate on, that happened. And I say, what would have been different if you had this strategy in place? If you had paused after this and your whole team had come together and you all told each other, good job, we did the best we can. Or if your leader had called you that night and had said, are you doing okay? Or if you were able to sit down with a chaplain for a few minutes and just talk through what had happened. And it wouldn't have changed the situation wholly, but it would have helped them. They all said it would have helped them. So as a leader, we can build in the structure to help that. We can build in the structure to help decrease the burnout and mitigate that secondary traumatic stress for our staff. When we think about our moral distress situations, which we didn't even touch on moral distress too much in this presentation, but those opportunities where there's really an ethical dilemma that might contribute to the burnout in our staff, there are toolkits that we can put in place. Peer support is a number one evidence-based strategy to put in to say, are you okay? If it's the manager calling you, or if we just have peers that are trained to check in on others when we know they've had a bad day. Debriefing after the end of a high stress event. And normally we don't even need to define what a high stress event is. We know it. We know when we experience one of these types of events, and we know when we need that peer support, when we need that debriefing, when we need a chaplain to come in. So what do all these things do? They create the connection. They decrease the isolation. So when we have this structure built in place, we give our staff the opportunity to engage in it, to create connection, to check in and say, okay, are you okay? And again, I'll go back to utilizing it, because it's not enough just to create it. We have to utilize it. We can't just give it to the new grads or the residents. We can't just say, oh, these are for you nurses that might need it. We all have to engage in it, because we don't know if somebody needs it. We don't know if we're going to be okay now, but maybe not be okay 24 or 48 hours from now. If we all engage in it together, then we're creating that culture of well-being. So we have to change the culture. We have to remember self-care is not a 4-letter word. And we as the leaders are the ones that role model that. We engage our supervisors. We engage our seasoned, tenured nurses. We engage those that are our well-being champions, our role models. And we simply just hold our staff accountable to making sure that this is our culture. So on the final note, we talk a lot about these as strategies, but what is the difference between a strategy versus a culture, right? We want to create this well-being culture. We want to make sure that we build it into our organizational culture, but I've given you ideas for strategies. So how do we make sure this is not a one-off? What is that long-term picture? I just want to touch on that briefly. What can the organization as a whole do to lean into this and say, this is that well-being culture? Well, first, we want to make sure that we are not only measuring data on our staff, but we're using it, right? It's not just enough to know that our staff's burned out. We need to use that data and act on it to create a better well-being environment. We want to reduce the stigma. And, we've kind of danced around that issue by talking about things that we can do and role modeling, but it's such a larger picture in thinking about the stigma associated with well-being. It has to include all of these strategies, but the actions, engaging, utilizing the things, and backed up with HR policies, resources, activities that actually support, walking the walk, not just talking the talk, behaviors and role modeling the well-being. And overall, overarching all of it, we have to normalize well-being. So we have to make it just part of our normal culture. It's part of our rounds, it's part of our discussions, it's part of our workflow. We prioritize it, we act on it, and we make sure we're all okay. So Again, these are references I highly encourage you to check out, looking at the healthy work environment, checking out the recommendations from the National Academy of Medicine, looking at the activities like the Greater Good Science Center, and the evidence-based articles that talk about where we get our sources of stress and how we think about burnout.